There was a time when television flickered softly in the corner of the living room, wood-paneled walls, shag carpet underfoot, parents half watching from recliners while children sat cross-legged on the floor. The 1970s felt safe, familiar, predictable, or at least that's what we remember. But hidden between variety shows and sitcom laughter were films that slipped into homes unannounced, stories soaked in dread, grief, paranoia, and psychological terror. These weren't midnight horror films in grimy theaters. They were network broadcasts. Prime time. Watched by families. And somehow they got away with it. The 1970s wasn't sanitized television. It was bold, experimental, often deeply disturbing. It tested the limits of what could be shown in American living rooms and sometimes crossed them. Tonight, we revisit 15 made-for-TV films that were darker than you remember. And as we count down, ask yourself, how did this ever air on network television? Duel 1971. Duel is the kind of stripped-down thriller that feels almost too intense for television, and that is exactly why it became legendary, because a young Steven Spielberg took a simple story about a traveling salesman played by Dennis Weaver being terrorized on a desert highway by a mysterious semi-truck and turned it into pure nerve-shredding suspense with barely any dialogue, and no clear explanation for the truck driver motive, and the behind-the-scenes reality is that it was shot in just a matter of days for ABC as part of their movie of the week, yet Spielberg used dynamic camera angles, low ground shots, and aggressive editing to transform that rusty truck into something that felt alive, almost demonic, and audiences at home were stunned that something so relentless, so claustrophobic, and so psychologically punishing could air on network television, and the film was so effective it was later expanded for theatrical release overseas, cementing its cult reputation and marking the moment the world first witnessed Spielberg's ability to turn minimalism into cinematic terror. Salem's Lot 1979. Salem's Lot brought small-town America face-to-face with pure nightmare when director Tobe Hooper adapted Stephen King's vampire novel for CBS, and cast David Soul as a writer returning to his hometown only to discover an ancient evil quietly infecting every neighbor and friend. And what made this miniseries feel so dangerous was its patience, the way it allowed dread to seep slowly into ordinary suburban streets before unleashing unforgettable images like the pale, floating child scratching at a bedroom window, which traumatized a generation of kids who thought they were just watching regular TV. And despite censorship limits, Hooper pushed atmosphere and shadow to their absolute limits, proving that network television could deliver gothic horror as haunting as anything playing in theaters, which is why decades later Salem's Lot is still whispered about as one of the scariest television events ever broadcast. The Night Stalker 1972. The Night Stalker turned investigative journalism into supernatural obsession as Darren McGavin introduced audiences to the rumpled, relentless reporter Carl Kolchak chasing what appears to be a Las Vegas serial killer who might actually be a vampire. And written by horror master Richard Matheson, the film cleverly blended police procedural realism with eerie folklore, grounding its horror in smoky casinos and neon-lit streets. And when it aired on ABC, it became the highest-rated TV movie at the time, shocking executives who underestimated how hungry viewers were for darker storytelling. And Kolchak's sarcastic narration mixed with genuine creeping dread created a character so compelling that he inspired a sequel and later influenced shows like The X-Files. And that blend of wit, realism, and supernatural menace is exactly why The Night Stalker remains a cult cornerstone of televised horror. Trilogy of Terror 1975. Trilogy of Terror delivered 3 unsettling tales anchored by a fearless dual performance from Karen Black, but it was the final segment featuring a tiny Zuni fetish doll that came to life and relentlessly stalked her through a cramped apartment that permanently burned itself into pop culture memory. And again penned by Richard Matheson, the film used tight editing, distorted camera angles, and frantic sound design to turn a small plastic figure into pure nightmare fuel, and viewers who expected a mild anthology were left gripping their couches as that screeching doll chased Black from room to room, proving that creativity could outmatch budget limitations. And the image of that doll with its razor teeth and manic energy became so iconic that it elevated the entire movie into cult legend status, still referenced and parodied decades later. Go Ask Alice 1973. Go Ask Alice shocked suburban living rooms by confronting teenage drug addiction with a bluntness rarely seen on television, following a bright young girl whose curiosity spirals into dependency, despair, and alienation, and starring Jamie Smith Jackson in a performance that felt uncomfortably real. The film refused to glamorize rebellion, instead presenting addiction as isolating, humiliating, and devastating for families watching together at home, and marketed as being based on a supposedly true diary. It tapped into parental fears of the era, turning what could have been an after-school special into something emotionally harrowing, and its willingness to tackle taboo issues head-on during prime time is exactly why it gained cult recognition as one of the most daring socially conscious TV movies of the 70s. Bad Ronald 1974. Bad Ronald transformed ordinary suburbia into a suffocating psychological trap when a socially awkward teenager played by Scott Jacoby accidentally commits a crime and hides inside the secret spaces of his house while a new family unknowingly moves in, and the genius of the film lies in its quiet tension, the way it forces viewers to sit with Ronald's isolation, guilt, and warped fantasies as he watches life continue without him, and airing on NBC it unnerved audiences who suddenly looked at their own walls a little differently, because the idea that someone could be living inches away unseen felt far more disturbing than any masked killer, and that creeping domestic paranoia is why Bad Ronald continues to hold cult fascination among fans of slow-burning psychological horror. Brian's Song 1971. Brian's Song proved that heartbreak could hit just as hard as horror when James Caan and Billy D. Williams portrayed the real-life friendship between football players Brian Piccolo and Gale Sayers, and instead of spectacle the film leaned into vulnerability, chronicling illness, loyalty, and interracial friendship with an honesty rarely seen on television at the time, and broadcast on ABC it moved millions to tears, becoming one of the most watched and discussed TV movies ever, and its emotional sincerity paired with two powerhouse performances transformed it into a cultural touchstone that audiences revisit not for thrills but for the raw reminder of love, loss, and human connection. The Quested Tapes 1974. The Quested Tapes, created by Gene Roddenberry, followed an android portrayed by Robert Foxworth searching for his missing creator while wrestling with questions about identity, free will, and what it means to be human, and though it was intended as a pilot for a series that never materialized due to creative conflicts, the film stood out for its philosophical ambition, using science fiction not for spectacle but introspection, and in a decade fascinated by technology and social change, its calm, thoughtful tone and existential themes attracted a loyal cult audience who appreciated its intelligence and quiet depth, making The Quested Tapes a hidden gem of 70s speculative television. The Autobiography of Miss Jane Pittman 1974. The Autobiography of Miss Jane Pittman delivered sweeping historical drama through a transformative performance by Cicely Tyson, who aged decades on screen to portray a woman surviving slavery, Reconstruction, and the Civil Rights Movement, and airing in prime time, the film confronted racial injustice with emotional clarity and unflinching honesty, challenging audiences to face painful chapters of American history within their own living rooms, and Tyson's performance was so powerful it earned widespread acclaim and awards, elevating the film beyond a simple TV event into a landmark cultural achievement that remains essential viewing. Gargoyles 1972. Gargoyles brought ancient winged creatures crashing into the modern Arizona desert when anthropologists uncover a hidden species fighting to survive extinction, and starring Cornel Wilde and Jennifer Salt, the film blended folklore, creature feature thrills, and surprisingly elaborate makeup effects for a television production, giving audiences monsters that felt tactile and dangerous, and its mix of mythology, action, and 70s grit turned it into a late-night favorite for genre fans who appreciated how boldly it embraced fantasy at a time when network budgets were tight and imagination had to do the heavy lifting. Don't Be Afraid of the Dark 1973. Don't Be Afraid of the Dark transformed a stately old mansion into a whispering claustrophobic nightmare as a woman played by Kim Darby begins hearing tiny voices from inside the walls, and what unfolds is less about jump scares and more about escalating dread as shadows stretch and unseen creatures taunt her sanity. And broadcast on ABC, the film terrified viewers so deeply that many still credit it with sparking lifelong fears of dark corners, NB basement doors, and its reliance on atmosphere suggestion and sound rather than explicit visuals is precisely what gives it enduring cult power. The California Kid 1974. The California Kid roared onto television screens with muscle cars, dusty highways, and simmering revenge as Martin Sheen plays a young outsider, challenging a corrupt small-town sheriff portrayed by Vic Morrow and directed with gritty energy. The film captured the rebellious spirit of the decade, tapping into distrust of authority and fascination with car culture, and its explosive stunts and tense showdowns gave it theatrical intensity, despite its TV origins earning it lasting admiration among fans of 70s action cinema. A Cold Night's Death, 1973. A Cold Night's Death trapped Robert Culp and Eli Wallach inside a remote Arctic research station where strange occurrences spark paranoia and suspicion, and rather than relying on visible monsters, the film builds tension through isolation, silence, and psychological unease, forcing viewers to question whether the threat is external or internal. And its slow burn atmosphere and ambiguous menace helped it gain cult respect as one of the most intelligently crafted suspense TV movies of the era. The Night Strangler, 1973. The Night Strangler reunited audiences with Carl Kolchak as Darren McGavin once again chases a seemingly impossible killer, this time beneath the streets of Seattle, expanding the mythology established in The Night Stalker and deepening the character's cynical charm and relentless curiosity. And though sequels rarely match originals, this one strengthened Kolchak cult status, proving there was still plenty of appetite for supernatural crime stories on network television and paving the way for future paranormal procedurals. The Strange Possession of Mrs. Oliver, 1977. The Strange Possession of Mrs. Oliver starred Karen Black as a quiet housewife who suddenly begins transforming into an entirely different personality, possibly linked to past life trauma and repressed desires, and blending psychological drama with supernatural mystery. The film explored themes of identity, autonomy, and the pressures placed on women in a way that felt daring for prime-time television, and Black fearless performance anchored its emotional intensity, turning what could have been melodrama into something haunting and provocative, which is why it continues to be remembered as one of the most psychologically unsettling cult TV movies of the 70s. Looking back, it's tempting to remember the 1970s as warm and nostalgic. Safe programming, simpler times. But these films prove otherwise. They challenged authority. They confronted grief. They explored addiction, racism, existential dread, and moral ambiguity, all through the supposedly safe medium of network television. So the question is, was 1970s TV braver than we remember? And which of these films disturbed you the most? Let me know in the comments. Share your memories. And if you enjoy revisiting the darker corners of television history, subscribe, because sometimes the scariest stories aren't found in theaters. They were already in our living rooms.